We're here, of course, to celebrate two amazing books that, of course, are labors of love, and you're going to get a chance to meet both authors and hear a little bit from them, and also they'll be reading a little bit from their work. But of course, we wanted to have these two authors here together to kind of make a larger point as well, to, of course, not to be thinking of individual works of scholarship or individual works of writing as isolated, but also as linked historically. So I should welcome you to the APA Institute. My name is Jack Chen. I'm the director of the APA. And a lot of times people ask why we have these slashes, between Asian, Pacific, and American. And it goes back to the story of, in some ways, these are constantly fluid terms. The notion of America, what does America mean? Well, in the US, we tend to think of we're America, and these other parts of this continent, North and South, are not part of the Americas. But of course, that's not true, right? And this whole question, for me, I think this became starkly evident and obvious in some of the research I was doing about New York Chinatown and New York City's history. I began looking in the census records, going back as early as I could, and looking for names of people who were born in China. Many of them were anglicized names going back into the 1830s, 1820s. This is before there were San Francisco, which is where we think of where Chinese begin to arrive. So this question of when did Chinese begin to arrive in America, right, is a complicated one. So I began detecting non-Chinese names who were cigar peddlers in New York in the 1850s. And they were coming from Cuba. And then I began, kind of thinking more about some of the stories I was reading about from some of the Latin American historians about the guano harvest and the indentures, Chinese indentured who were brought to the Chincha Islands outside of Callao. And there were thousands, eons of years of bird poop that had deposited on these islands, and Chinese were brought there to harvest them. And the story is, of course, again, more complicated because it was someone by the name of W.R. Grace who was a ship chandler, and he actually began realizing the potential profits of harvesting this fertilizer. In part, what he did is he developed a whole shipping line, and we used to remember the W.R. Grace building on 42nd Street, and he developed his whole chemicals and materials industry through that early kind of harvesting. He was the one in part responsible for, being part of an industry that brought Chinese indentured laborers there. And that fertilizer was actually used in part to go to the U.S. South, where enslaved Africans were working the tobacco plantations. Okay, so complicated. Grace. Why are we not hearing that about W.R. Grace? It's really part of the formation of American capitalism, and we tend not to hear about the stories of people who were the workers. And so there's lots of questions there, but also, well, when do Asians begin to first arrive in the Americas, broadly defined? Well, it's Manila, Acapulco is probably one likely, source of that in the mid 1500s, when the Spanish galleons are going from Acapulco to Manila, and Asians are beginning to come, Filipinos and various Chinese and other folks are coming back in the ships to Mexico City and going up north and south as well, right? So this history has a far deeper story than we've tend to understand and acknowledge. So these two works, in many ways, as I was saying, are, of course, wonderful individual works, but they're also part of a growing, developing tradition in which the archival evidence that they've been digging up, and the personal stories they've been digging up, and the ways in which individual and family stories can be increasingly located within these larger narratives that have tended not to be part of the history of not just the United States, but also of the Americas. One final story. I was really happy to gain a kind of personal connection with this story when when I was back at the New York Chinatown History Project, and at one of our board meetings, the staff and board members were coming together, and one of our board members was Toby Dench, who has just passed away recently. And he's and also one of our staff members is Fabiana Chu. Fabiana's from Lima, grew up as Chinese Peruvian in the Chinese section of Lima. And Toby Dench is a descendant of the Grace family. So I'm driving them home in my Volkswagen Beetle, and I wanted them to meet because they were both not aware of this history that I had become aware of through reading books. And I wanted them to meet each other to kind of come, in some ways, it was kind of a historical reckoning between a member of the Grace family, who is a board member and really progressive, very important member of the founding board, and Fabiana Chu, who began to realize that her family story probably does go back to some of those early workers who were in the Chincha Islands and survived. And that story, history personalized, is really, to me, part of what we're trying to do, not to just talk about abstract forces, but to actually understand the people actually involved in reclaiming those stories. So I'm really delighted that we can have this program tonight and have these two really wonderful pieces of work as part of that, as part of what we're talking about. Let me just briefly thank our co-sponsor for this event, which is the NYU Center for Multicultural Education Programs. I'm really happy that we could do this together. And also Amita, who is the incredible events director and communications director of APA, and she's always the one who's making these things happen and pulling it all together and being so gracious about it. So Amita, thank you very much. Here to introduce the speakers and to frame some of what we'll be hearing tonight is Sukhdev Sandhu, who is a professor here in the Department of Social and Cultural Analysis and also the Department of English, and also someone who is a critic and person who also runs the Unpopular Culture series here at NYU, which I highly commend and recommend you to check out as well. Sukhdev Sandhu, thank you.
Thank you all very much for coming. Can you hear me at the back? Okay, thanks. So we're here to celebrate and talk about two books, Kathleen López's Chinese Cubans, The Transnational History, and Gaiutra Bahadur's Coolie Woman, The Odyssey of Indenture. Both of them, if you've had a chance to read them or to look at them, you'll see that they contain bountiful riches. They don't so much as kind of define or attempt to end a subject, but to open it up to new conjectures, new speculations, new research projects. They're invitations as much as they are tombstones. Lots of our history books tend to try to kind of kill the subject in one goes, and these books are both the opposite. I thought I would open, however, with a quotation from a writer, a philosopher, a poet, who I sometimes have a sense that his work is not quite as well known in the States as it might be. I hope I'm wrong. It's a Mauritian writer, Cal Toraboli, and he's come to be known as the foremost theoretician of what he calls coolitude. And both of these works, at one level, could be seen as history's commemorations of the dreams, the yearnings, the journeys, the struggles, the resiliences of Chinese and Indian coolies in the Caribbean. This extract is taken from a letter Toraboli wrote to the writer Amitav Ghosh. When I wrote Cal d'Etoile Coolitude, he says, the founding book of the oceanic voyage of the coolies in 1989, I wanted to pay homage to the forgotten voices of the voyage, the coolies. At that time, the word coolie was thought as base and derogatory, and it was a pleasure and a duty for me, as a poet of plural visions and of the peripheries, to reclaim the coolie, and from this derelict history and identity, I used the term coolie to coin coolitude, very much as Aimé Césaire did for negritude, though I took my distances from any essentialist view straight from the outset. I carved it this word, as the basis of a humanism of diversity born from the mosaic India, migrating through indenture. I played with languages and with archives, moved to silences of archives, sketched the centrality of the voyage of the Coolie as a space of construction and deconstruction of identities, giving a primordial role to the ocean, so as to move away from the Galapani petrification, the black waters petrification of a certain version of Asian historiography. In that sense, I also write about the sea and the Indian Ocean, just like you, with my own modest voice. And it's interesting to read this out in light of what Jack's just been saying about the waterways of transnationalism. Now, Amitav Ghosh, as many of you will know, is one of the sort of key imaginative oceanographers of the last few decades, and he's clearly been both influenced and seen a kind of sort of parallel project going on with Torribuli's work. Another person who's a great admirer of Torribuli is the historian, art critic, novelist, and poet David Dabadine, Indo-Guyanese poet David Dabadine. He made a documentary about 20 years ago now for the BBC about Cooliedom, a history of Asian migration both to Africa and to the Caribbean in the 19th century, and also about the reinvention of empire in that process. And it's this, you can find it floating around online, quite sort of degraded version, almost necessarily degraded, sprawling, tentacular work about creating a kind of sort of new internationalism from the bottom up. And two parts of it are kind of branded in my imagination since I first saw it. One is the camera is in the ship and it's going towards to where, possibly the Caribbean, possibly to Guyana, probably the unknown. But we're looking and we see suddenly sand, the beach come into view. We're arriving at one point, and then the camera swivels round and we look back. And what you see is absolutely nothing. If as one of the people who managed to survive that arduous voyage, the sickness, the sores, the loneliness, the cruelty on board ship, perhaps it occurred to me that if I was there, I would squint and I would squint and I would squint, and I would try to see some kind of spectra of my motherland, of my homeland, a kind of some necessary dreaming. Perhaps it would still, that country would ring in my ears, and I could, even if it was delusionary, I could find some companionship in that moment. But all you see is this ocean, and it looks big and aching and voided. And suddenly, even as a viewer, the kind of, sort of reality of exile, of migration really sort of hits you. You're confronted with the loneliness of arrival, the sense that history is a blank page. And there's a sense of possibility there and excitement, but it's also a kind of sort of avoiding of history. And the second moment in this film is when Dabadine goes to find out more about his family. And he goes to this rather sort of grotty-looking library / archive / cowshed. It's not clear. But there's very little air conditioning. It's poorly maintained. The volumes of people's names and of sort of ship's logs, you can imagine you'd find them in a junk store. But almost miraculously, he finds what he's looking for, just bits of names, precious, tiny, scribbled data. So there should be a moment of triumph and connection. He's found a through line. He can kind of embark upon that imaginative journey that will connect him to continents that he's not known and that his parents felt isolated from. But as a viewer, what you're aware of is everything that's happening just from his hand. Because as he picks up the volume and as he turns the pages, they literally turn to dust in his hand and scribbled almost like kind of outsider handwriting, even across the margin. And you see squiggles, presumably names of captains or names of ships disappearing forever. In the very moment of encounter, in the very moment of connection, is also this dramatic, horrible disappearance. And as researchers, as historians, as people who speculate, that's an incredibly sort of beautiful and sort of troubling moment. It gives you a sense of just the importance of what you do, the tactility, the preciousness with which you encounter of those archives. And maybe what we're doing when we're thinking about indenture is occupying the sort of imaginative space of disappearance, even a material disappearance. So Kathleen López, to me, and Gaiutra Bahadur have produced two books, one about Chinese Cuba and one about Indo-Guyana, that really do the kinds of work that I've been dreaming of as a teacher, and I've produced kind of books that snag my imagination, that I can give to my students, that I can give to friends. It almost made me wonder. This is perhaps a sort of bad taste conceit. If there is a way in which we should aspire to be or think of ourselves as kind of indentured scholars, or if scholarship is a form of indenture, we think we're signing up for a certain amount of time. You sign a book contract, or you think you're going on some kind of sort of tenure timeline, and you try to meet it, of course, and you think it's going to be over at a certain point of time. But of course, sometimes, or quite often, we miss it. We're not in a position to let go. We find ourselves tethered, maybe necessarily, and haunted and troubled by a sense of duty, both coerced and maybe to some extent voluntary, to the new landscapes through which we've been moving in our research. And the research is difficult, physically, emotionally, imaginatively, something that comes across very much in these books. And I think in our case, for kind of scholars of migration and of often kind of immiserated labor, this opportunity to excavate these histories, to hack at and through the kind of wilderness of amnesia and of sort of misrepresentations over decades, it's incredibly important to us. We don't want to let go. It may be a sickness. It may be violating to us, but we have to keep going through it. And both of these books bear the stretch marks, the sort of toil of this really long durational research. And as a reader, I myself am very, very grateful for that. The format for this evening is we're going to have presentations from each of the speakers lasting around 15 minutes. And then we are going to have a conversation between myself and Kathy and Gaiutra, and for, 15, 20 minutes. And then it's going to be a conversation between all of us, or questions, responses, and please do think of yourself as kind of collaborators in this evening's conversation. So I think we're going to start with Gaiutra. So Gaiutra Bahadur. Just a word about biography. This is her first book. She's mostly known at the moment as a writer, as a book critic for a wide number of publications, including The Nation, Washington Post Book World, New York Times Book Review, The London Observer. She was a Nieman Fellow, I think that's how it's pronounced, at Harvard during 2007 to 2008. And she's won a number of grants, both from the New Jersey State Council on the Arts and the Barbara Deming Memorial Fund. I'll also say a little bit about Kathy, so just that we have a kind of more sort of neat segue before her talk. Kathleen López is an assistant professor at the Department of Latino and Hispanic Caribbean Studies and the Department of History at Rutgers. And she mostly specializes in the historical intersections between Asia and Latin America and the Caribbean. She currently serves on the board of advisors for Dr. Xiaoyu Bao Overseas Chinese Documentation and Research Center at Ohio University Libraries. And she's also involved with the Collective for Asian American Studies, Transnational New Jersey, and Critical Caribbean Studies. Gaiutra. Thank you very much. And
wow. Thanks, Jack and Sukhdev, for that context and for that poetry. Really, that's amazing. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. And thanks to the APA Institute for hosting this conversation. I'm just going to make a few opening remarks, then I'll read a few passages from the book. A scholar of indenture in Trinidad, Kushaharik Singh, has spoken of the need to free ourselves from the tyranny of the text in recovering our histories. He's right. The text is tyrannical. It was written by those in power who obviously have a vested interest in telling the story from their own perspective. The perspectives of the indentured, their voices are for the most part missing from the historical record. Since for the most part they weren't literate, certainly not in English, they didn't leave behind letters or diaries. I'm aware of two indenture memoirs, one out of Fiji, one out of Suriname, and both were written by men. So the silence in the archives applies especially to women. They did not write down their own stories in their own words. We read them only indirectly through the often biased prism of government officials who occasionally took their testimonies. Still, I don't see myself as overthrowing the text as much as questioning it. I spent many, many hours reading and analyzing ship reports, newspaper accounts of violence against women, transcripts of official inquiries into plantation uprisings. And these were all very rich and valuable sources. However incomplete, however one-sided, they provided these extraordinary human glimpses into the lives of women. At times, it almost seemed like these elusive figures were peeking out from behind a curtain, the one separating the women's quarters from the rest of the house of official history. I found stories of particular women. There were stories of suffering, but also stories of daring, stories of victims, but also stories that showed the women striving for agency, their sort of really fierce will to be in charge of their own destinies. So I recognized the flaws of the records, but in the end, I didn't oust them. I approached them with skepticism. And then I supplemented them. I wove oral histories, folk songs, the Hindu epic, the Ramayana, and even body art into the narrative. Where Indian women could not speak for themselves, I looked for alternate ways of recovering their commitments and experiences. And I wove myself into the narrative as their descendant. The book traces the journey of my great-grandmother from Calcutta to Guyana in 1903. She was 4 months pregnant and she was traveling alone. This first reading is from the chapter set on the seas. It's called Her Middle Passage, and it's based on the records, the ship records for 77 voyages from India to the West Indies. I'm sorry, bear with me. I'm a bit sick, so kind of dehydrated. I'm just going to take a swig of water. On that mad ocean. I cannot imagine that the journey was anything but a saga, even for emigrants whose lives aboard passed relatively without incident. Seasickness afflicted most. A majority fell ill with mumps, measles, dysentery, hookworm, or fever. The ache for home was so sharp that one ship surgeon declared, "I know that many die from nostalgia, pure and simple. The excitement of the newness of everything keeps them up for a time, but soon dies away, and is followed by depression when they realize what they have done." The realization must have dawned slowly as the sea lengthened and the conditions aboard affected them one by one, as blankets rough as jute, sometimes rotten and foul-smelling, caused pus to form on the children, as the fans for circulating air were shut down at night when most needed, as the condenser to make the water potable broke, which it routinely did, and as the floor beneath them sweated. All the while, surgeons prepared their balance sheets of births and deaths, recording Shiva's unending dance without realizing it. The Hindu god who destroys in order to create, who dances in a ring of flames to maintain the universe's ceaseless cycle of creation and destruction, did not forget the cargo hold. I'm referring to something far more metaphysical than mortality or birth rates. Here, a woman born on a ship to the West Indies in 1888. On that mad ocean, when all was tossing, people's heads were spinning, and then labor pains started for Ma to have her child. On that mad ocean, I was born. On that mad ocean, I came to life. She was describing her own origins, but with her incantatory words, she could have been telling the creation story of our people, mine and hers. She could have continued in her voice of myth. In our beginning, there was a boat. On that mad ocean, we came to life. We passed the Red Sea to reach the Black. The water was blue before it was green, and then it was mud. We crossed 7 seas, 7 shades of water, shades of darkness and light. Light that died and darkness that was born. Darkness somehow extinguished and light rekindled. The captain's wheel became Shiva's fiery circle, turning and turning in its cosmic spiral. And in the gyrating of the gales and the churning of the waves, as one steered and the other danced, we became new. The moorings of caste had loosened, and people who had left behind uncles, sisters, husbands, and mothers substituted shipmates, their jahajis, for kin. Unraveled, they began, ever so slowly, to spin the threads of a novel identity. Indentureships were not slave ships, but there can be no denying a few ties that should have bound the 3 million Africans trafficked by the British as slaves, and the 1 million Indians transported as coolies. The people in the hold in both cases were cut from the same demographic, mainly young and overwhelmingly male. Women were in short supply and subject to sexual exploitation during both crossings. And both journeys were transformative, signaling a break with the past, making whatever came before seem almost as unimaginable to later generations as time and space before the Big Bang. In the beginning, there was a boat. Having emerged from its belly as survivors, the indentured Indians could no longer be who they had been. Like the slaves before them, they were an entirely new people, forged by suffering, created through destruction. In this sense, above all else, theirs was a middle passage. Okay, this second reading is from a chapter about what were called wife murders. Indian women were shipped to plantations in a ratio of 40 women for every 100 men. So they were in short supply, and this gave them a degree of choice in partners. They could leave one man for another or say no to men. But there was a violent backlash when they did. More than 167 women were killed by partners or would-be partners in Guyana during the indenture era. In their attempt to explain the violence, British officials resorted to racist stereotypes. They ascribed the murders to possessiveness and promiscuity, traits they saw as inherently Indian. In Calcutta, the emigration agent for Guyana argued that the violence was, quote, due rather to the race than the place. Planters had already embraced this theory. They cited the low incidence of wife murders among Chinese, who had also come indentured, and who confronted the worst woman shortage of any community in Guyana. The colony's Royal Gazette editorialized in 1863, the disproportion being greater in the case of the Chinese, the same sad result might be expected. But experience has shown that while as a rule the Chinese females are chaste, the same cannot be said for the Coolie women. Not long after, the same paper reported on a Chinese woman's fatal stabbing by a man she had sexually betrayed. But such crimes were few because the Chinese were few. The impression persisted that Indians murdered their women while Chinese did not. But indenture was what distinguished Indian from Chinese women. The latter were required to live on plantations but weren't bound by contract to work on them. Unexposed to the glare of sun and suitors in cane fields, most Chinese women led lives more protected and more restricted than their Indian counterparts did. Still, the press charged that Chinese women were morally better, and the question of the quote-unquote quality of Indian women continued to dog the debate on why they were killed. The women were twice victimized. First, they were physically mutilated. Then their reputations were dismembered by European and Indian men alike. A former indentured man in Fiji reflected from the vantage of old age, money, the desire for money and more money and jewels led to the downfall of our women. They change their men as they change their lengas. An Australian overseer in Fiji veered between portraying Indian women as, on the one hand, amorally sensual as animals, and on the other, immorally calculating in their conquests. In his memoir, he recounted an exchange between an Indian beauty, he called her a Hindu with the morals of an alley cat, and a man she outbid at an auction. When the man stage whispered, "Ask the little slut where her bank is," the woman retorted, "Tell the fat one that it's where he can't get his hands on it, between my legs." Rarely do Coolie women get to talk back to official history, to challenge its view of them. If they answer the slander, it is indirectly, across time, through the women and their families who told tales across the generations. One story is of two immigrant forefathers, one Chinese, one Indian, adapting to Guyana's shortage of women. The Chinese man was an imperial civil servant who had fled the Taiping Rebellion. The Indian man came from a similar background, unused to hard labor. Displaced, out of their element, they toiled side by side, weeders both. The Indian man had a wife and children to carry on his name. The Chinese man did not. And so, in, quote, an act of brotherly love, the Indian loaned his wife to the Chinese man. The swap lasted only until the woman became pregnant. She gave birth to a boy, and the Indian man gave the baby to the Chinese man to be raised. Every Sunday ever after, they would all meet by the riverside. The two men would talk, and the child would play with his mother, the accommodating Hindu woman shared between two men, known to the generations only as Gangang. Okay, so this final reading is about the reconstruction of family, which was in ruins during indenture, and reconstruction after indenture. The rebuilding happened slowly as Indians moved from plantation barracks into surrounding villages. The shift was far from easy, especially if those villages had to be built from the ground up, on swampy land requiring resources to be reclaimed by people indebted to planters and the company store when their indentures ended. For the impoverished majority, leaving the plantation was a feat. It took years, even generations, to accomplish. And it would never have been accomplished if Indian women had not retreated into the domestic sphere. This was done for survival's sake. The family was a collective economic unit based on a division of labor by sex, with women working unpaid at home. A Guyanese woman born in plantation barracks during indenture told me, "No, me not walk back down the cane fields. Me walk home more hard, more than back down. I fork, I dig drain, I do all kind of thing. Cut grass, mind cow, mind donkey, mind children. Plant garden, mind cow and sell the milk. Forget thing for buy for them children. Me work more hard home, more than back down. Me work hard." Indian women who withdrew from plantation labor carried colossal burdens. In addition to cooking, cleaning, washing, and raising children, they reared cattle, grew rice on family farms, and tended vegetable plots in family gardens to sell the produce at market or to feed their own. Some even continued to labor on the plantations on and off, but to a large extent they left the paid labor force to contribute to their family's livelihood. In this, the planters' wishes appear to have coincided with those of Indians, both male and female. Wasn't it, after all, Sita's sacrifice to serve husband and kin before self? And didn't most Hindu women of a certain generation have a reminder of Sita's duties branded into her skin? Many elderly Guyanese women have an intricate tattoo, its tendrils climbing up their inner arms, that dates back to their weddings. The woman who told me that family work was harder than plantation work explained her tattoo this way. "Disa when you married, Sita ki rasoy, daddy kitchen, you gafa cook, Sita ki rasoy." Sita ki rasoy, or Sita's kitchen, is a shrine in Faizabad with the image of a rolling pin carved above the entrance. In the epic Ramayana, the goddess Sita was supposed to have cooked the first meal for Ram there after their marriage. Tradition in Northeast India once dictated that brides couldn't cook for their in-laws until inked with a symbol representing Sita's kitchen. My great-grandmother Sujarya registered for indenture in the same city where that shrine is located, possessed that tattoo. For Coolie women, many of their daughters and some of their granddaughters, their vow of housewifely devotion was written on their very bodies. When Sujaria arrived at Rose Hall Plantation in 1906, the milk seller she would later marry still lived there, although he was no longer indentured. Together at some unknown point, they moved from the plantation to one of the colony's oldest established villages. Whether the plantation granted them land to keep their labor close at hand, whether they ceded their right to return to India in exchange for it, or whether they managed to buy it is unknown. What is known is that Sujaria, a paid worker on the plantation, became an unpaid milk seller's wife in the village. Every morning she boiled a pot of fresh cow's milk and went door to door with a tin can and pine cup, peddling. Every evening she boiled another pot and set it to curdle in chamber pots, purchased from fine shops in town and repurposed to make yogurt for sale. Her husband was a hard, ambitious man, a moneylender as well as a milk seller. One granddaughter distinctly remembers how once he thrashed a constable who tried to impound his cows. She recalls his violence towards Sujaria as well. He used to take a danta, a big walking stick, and maul her behind. He used to beat her bad. The sole photograph of Sujaria that survives is a family portrait, taken 3 decades after her arrival in Guyana. She sits on a chair in front of a rough-hewn house, an urnie properly draped over her silver hair, bangles stretching up her arms, her collar covering her throat, her brow high and proud. She looks every bit the matriarch, with a grandson expertly cradled on her lap, and another by her side clutching her sari. Although thin and taut, a centerpiece of composure and respect, Sujaria doesn't look severe. The corners of her mouth hint ever so slightly at a mother's satisfaction. Flanking her, her son born at sea and her daughter born in Guyana both rest a hand on her shoulder. Having likely relinquished parents, siblings, children, and possibly a husband in India, Sujaria succeeded in recreating family in Guyana. She instilled in her son and her son's sons a sense of duty to family, religious in its fervor and commitment. They labored as a unit, with children working too, because they had to feed each hungering body and also each starving sense of self, to eke out peasant existences away from the exploitation and indignity of the plantation, in villages where they might nourish themselves with institutions remembered from India and seek the consolations of religion, kin, and identity. This feat of survival and in slow time progress was not without costs. When she endured her husband's beatings and his silencing cries of chup, his attempts to control her charisma and sparking will, perhaps she contemplated the tattooed reminder of Sita's devotion on her arm. Did she ever doubt whether it was worth it to suffer dutifully like that remote goddess, to preserve family in a form of self-sacrifice? She had receded from the public sphere of the plantation to the more private sphere of the home and village. Each delivered its own set of licks, and each required its own brand of forbearance. As much as religion or culture, imperial policy had nudged her inside. For this, too, had been a disfigurement of indenture, the complicity of women in their own fates, the tortured attachment, the tenderness they felt and continue to feel in the cave of their hearts for their own men, who had also been disfigured by planters and the colonial state. Thank you.
Okay, thank you everyone for being here. Does the sound okay? I'd also like to thank Jack and Amita and the the APA Institute, and especially for hosting my affiliation when I had a postdoctoral fellowship several years ago when I was doing a lot of the research and writing for this book, what ultimately became the book. And I'd also like to thank Sukhdev and Gaiutra for being in conversation tonight, and all of you for the conversation that will unfold. So today, just to give you a brief overview of Chinese-Cuban history, today I'm going to be dealing with two life stories, family histories, that basically go through the major periods of how I've framed Chinese-Cuban history in the book. So the first is the period of indentured labor in the Spanish colony of Cuba from 1847 to 1874, when about 125,000, probably more, Chinese were sent to Cuba to work on mostly sugar plantations, and it was mostly a forced migration, or at least many Chinese were deceived once they got to Cuba. Then the post-indenture period of the 1880s and 1890s, when most of the Chinese who had been promised passage back were not actually able to go back to China. So those who survived, about 50%, stayed in Cuba and continued to work on sugar plantations, railroads and such. And then Republican Cuba. So Cuba gains independence from Spain, is occupied by the U.S., and the Republican period lasts through 1959. During this point, about 1917 to 1920 is when most Chinese came, and that was because the restrictions on entry were lifted during World War I. And then two major events, one in China and one in Cuba, both communist revolutions in 49 and in 59, caused major shifts in the demographics. So in 1949, the Chinese community in Cuba was boosted by people fleeing the PRC government. And then after 1959, especially after 1968, when all businesses were nationalized, many Chinese came to New York, and there they settled in places like New York and Miami. And that was the beginning of the Chinese-Cuban restaurants that we all love. And then the Chinese community in Cuba slowly went into decline until recently, 1990s and up to the present, when there's been a revitalization of the Chinese community in Cuba linked to tourism and those kinds of incentives. So what I'll do is just read a little bit from the introduction and from the epilogue of the book and trace these two family histories. In 1959, the 15-year-old Dong Gongcheng, a native of Dongguan County in Guangdong Province, China, was kidnapped and taken to the Spanish Caribbean colony of Cuba as part of the infamous coolie trade. He signed a contract of indenture that obligated him to work for 8 years on a sugar estate in Matanzas Province. There he was baptized and given the name Pastor Pelayo, after Cuban planter Ramon Pelayo. After completing his term of service, he was forced to recontract for another 8 years. When Pastor Pelayo finished his indenture, he was in his 30s and had no hope of returning to China. He migrated eastward to the sugar districts of central Cuba. There he moved from estate to estate, earning wages as part of a work gang, and eventually became a labor contractor. Recently out of bondage, the former Chinese indentured laborer came into daily contact with enslaved African men and women on the cusp of emancipation. Through earnings from his work gangs, he managed to accumulate enough money to purchase freedom for a domestic slave named Wenceslas and her brothers. Pastor Pelayo and Wenceslas entered into a common law union and had 9 children together, who they raised among a network of people of Chinese and African descent in the town of Cienfuegos. Pelayo emerged as a leader among the local Chinese, establishing an immigrant association and a theater. Both Pelayo and his first Cuban-born son Blas supported the war for independence from Spain in 1895 and registered as eligible voters after the establishment of the new Cuban Republic. In 1913, Pastor Pelayo died, insolvent due to a penchant for gambling. He's buried at a plot in La Reina Cemetery in Cienfuegos, much of which today is inundated with water and overgrown with weeds. I learned the story of the indentured laborer Pastor Pelayo when I met two of his Afro-Cuban grandsons in Cienfuegos. As I strolled down the dusty streets of the former Chinese neighborhood with the Pelayo brothers, they shared their family history with me. The dilapidated skeletons of Chinese shops and associations form a stark contrast between the tourist-oriented revitalization of the Barrio Chino in Havana today and the reality of smaller provincial towns where native Chinese are scarce. Since then, Blas Pelayo Diaz has refurbished the grave of his grandfather, who had come to the Spanish colony as a coolie and died there as a citizen of the Cuban Republic, a leader of the Chinese-Cuban community in Cienfuegos, and the patriarch of a mixed Chinese and African family. Just a few years later, when the Cuban government permitted the wartime importation of contract labor, a second major wave of Chinese migrants crossed the Pacific. Among them was Lui Fan, who in 1918, at age 18, emigrated from his village in Xinhui County, Guangdong Province. Lui Fan initially worked on a plantation to fulfill Cuba's need to increase sugar production during World War I. He soon abandoned the estate and began peddling vegetables in the town of Cienfuegos. Carrying 2 baskets on a bamboo pole balanced on his shoulders, Lui Fan became a familiar sight in his Cuban neighborhood, where he was known as Francisco Luis. A decade passed before Lui Fan made his first trip to his home village in China. He built a new house and married, with all of the villagers celebrating at an extravagant banquet. After his second return visit in 1930, his daughter Bao Qin was born, but he was unable to see her until another trip in 1932. His second daughter was born later that year, after he had already departed for Cuba. From overseas, he named her Ma Li, after the Western name Mary or Maria. Lui Fan never again returned to China, leaving his 2 daughters to grow up in the village without their father. Both married and had families of their own, but they maintained their father's ancestral home. Lui Fan dutifully sent home remittances once or twice a year, and for special occasions such as the birth of a grandchild, he sent home more money than usual. Back in Cuba, Francisco Luis developed a relationship with a Cuban woman, with whom he also had 2 daughters, Lourdes and Violeta, each of which he also gave a Chinese name, Gui Gui and Gui Pa, and you can see their names inscribed in their school bags in both Spanish and Chinese. This is the image we used for the cover of the book. The domestic arrangement deteriorated when their mother abandoned the family after 3 years. Luis raised his 2 Cuban daughters on his own while continuing to support his Chinese family. He encouraged a relationship between his Cuban daughters and his Chinese daughters by sending photos and writing letters on their behalf. His Cuban daughters believed that they were corresponding with Chinese cousins. From the beginning, however, his Chinese daughters knew that they had half-sisters in Cuba and referred to them as third sister, or Sanmei, and fourth sister, Simei. In addition to maintaining a trans-Pacific family, Francisco Luis belonged to a fraternal organization and an occupational guild, read Chinese newspapers, donated to China's resistance against the Japanese occupation in World War II, and attended Cantonese opera performances. He raised his Cuban daughters in a strict Catholic environment, but also taught them complementary points in the philosophies of Confucius and Lao Tzu. After Francisco Luis died in Cuba in 1975, his Cuban daughters were unable to transfer his remains back to China for burial. Across the ocean, fellow villagers emphasized that the Lui women needed to depend on themselves, and communication between the 4 sisters ceased for over a quarter of a century. So these are just 2 of the migration stories that produced the complex, multifaceted Chinese-Cuban community over the course of a century. The book examines the transnational history of these migrants and their multiple identities as Chinese and Cuban. Whether indentured or free, most migrants ultimately aimed to accumulate resources and return to China, rather than settle permanently in Cuba. The coerced nature of the coolie system, however, left little possibility for return. Free Chinese migrants in the Republican period worked to maintain transnational ties to Cuba, but many of them came to China, but many of them came to identify themselves as Cuban. On my first trip to Cuba in March 1999, I met Mitzi Espinosa Luis, who immediately told me the story of her Chinese grandfather, Francisco Luis, and his two daughters in China, a story of trans-Pacific migration, family, and separation. Although she has distant memories of her grandfather, Mitzi has always maintained a strong attachment to her Chinese heritage. In 2001, at a Chinese New Year's celebration in the Barrio Chino, Mitzi came one step closer to reconnecting with her grandfather's past when she met two elderly Chinese, Felipe and Santiago Luis, with the same surname and from the same village. The 96-year-old Felipe, who was born in 1903, was about the same age as Mitzi's grandfather would have been. Through a fictive kinship for fellow villagers, Felipe and Santiago Luis came to consider Mitzi a granddaughter. So in 2001, armed with copies of old photos and letters addressed to the Lui family, I embarked on a journey to try to locate his descendants in China. With the assistance of the local Chinese Overseas Affairs Office, I met both of his Chinese daughters, Baoqin and Mali, as well as their children and grandchildren. When I visited their house, I was amazed to find old photos of Francisco Luis and his Cuban daughters hanging on the wall, attesting to the endurance of family connection. Communication between the Chinese sisters and the Cuban sisters resumed, and they had never met in person, with the grandchildren now taking an active role in translating and sending email messages. So while many Cuban youth dream of going to the United States, Mitzi Espinosa Luis had always wanted to travel to China while growing up. In May 2009, through much bureaucratic procedures and legwork, Mitzi's dream to meet her Chinese relatives became a reality. And so what I'd like to do is just play a few minutes of video from her trip. And what this hasn't been subtitled, so what you're going to hear is a variety of languages, maybe some English, some mostly Cantonese, Mandarin. The Mandarin is when people are speaking to me, because I don't understand Cantonese, but I can speak and understand Mandarin, and Spanish, which is Mitzi's the only language that Mitzi speaks. So you'll see all that. This is Mitzi looking at her grandfather's village. She's on a rooftop. Poor Mitzi. So you can see the contrast to this kind of standard image that we see. It's been very common for Americans of Chinese descent to, and really all over the world, to visit their home villages, and the home villages are open to this and facilitating it. For Cuban, it's been more rare, but recently there have been more opportunities. So this is the standard photo, but you can see from the video, so the kind of almost chaos behind part of it and the confusion. And the woman who's speaking Cantonese is Evelyn Hu-Dehart, who knows something like 5 languages and can just easily go back and forth. So just by way of conclusion, the collected histories in this book demonstrate nuances and layers in Chinese migration to Cuba from the middle of the 19th century to the present. At each corner, they overturn images of Chinese migrants that have dominated historiography and literature and demonstrate the long process of becoming Cuban. The image of the Chinese migrant as an in-between category between black and white, between slave and free, is undermined by Coolie's testimony that they were actually treated worse than slaves. The image of the Chinese coolie as victim turned patriot is tempered by evidence of their self-interest in profiteering from the system. The image of standoffish Chinese scorning black slaves is complicated by Afro-Asian families that developed soon after indenture. The image of a clannish bachelor Chinatown is undermined by the transnational lives that Chinese men maintained with their home villages and families. And the image of wealthy Chinese merchants fleeing Castro's Cuba is countered by one of revolutionary Chinese-Cuban militiamen storming the Kuomintang building, or Chinese Nationalist Party. Looking from the ground up, it is clear that the Chinese have been central to Cuban history from the moment of their arrival, in particular to the linked questions of race, labor, and citizenship in the post-emancipation Caribbean world. Thank you.
Perhaps we should just begin quite quickly with what some people would regard as the elephant in the room, which is a word, which is the use of the word coolie, which some people might regard as Torabulli says, as derogatory, anachronistic, some kind of violation of linguistic and cultural sensibilities and mores today. What does it mean for both of you, and why do you, and how do you use it in your respective books?
Well, you mentioned Carl Tarabulli at the beginning of this, and his reclamation of the word is very much that, a reclamation. So he's taking a stance there, a political stance. And there's actually a long tradition in Guyana and Trinidad of writers and poets reclaiming that word. It comes from the Tamil, which means wages, or it sort of denotates hired help. In the West Indies, it was used by the British as an official term to describe indentured laborers, but as racial tensions developed, in particular in Guyana, it sort of became an ethnic slur. And it was also this inheritable marker of ethnicity. So even if you were the son of an indentured immigrant or the grandson, you could still be called a coolie. But the way I use it in my title is really more figuratively than politically. To me, the phrase Coolie Woman just so perfectly captures the burdens that indentured women and their descendants have had to bear over the generations. They're sort of carrying the baggage of colonialism on their back, also the weight of expectations that they be the ones to hold together families and cultures. So for me, it was more this figurative evocation of burden, really.
Is it on? Yeah. Yes, and also in the context of Spanish Cuba and also Peru, the word, although it was the same sort of trade that brought over these laborers, and remember you have Chinese also going to the British Caribbean, but the word also circulated in the Americas. And so it was used by travelers, it was used by Spanish government officials. It was used even into the 20th century after the period of indentured labor had ended. And it was derogatory, But one of the things is in Cuba, there was a tradition of, in the 20th century, the merchant class purposely distancing themselves from indentured labor. So I had mentioned that there were these restrictive immigration laws beginning in 1902. When the U.S. left occupying Cuba, they made sure that there was a law in place to prevent Chinese laborers from entering the country. And their fear was that Chinese would use Cuba as a stepping stone to get to the U.S., where there were exclusion acts in place. And so the merchant community begins full force to reclaim a place in Cuban history, talking about the suffering that they have already had. So using indentured labor for that purpose. You know, we had suffering as a people. We participated in the Cuban Wars for Independence, but then clearly making a mark, you know, a line in the sand, but we are not like these new laborers who are trying to come in. And that goes on through the 1940s. And so it's only recently in post-1959 revolutionary scholarship that Cuban scholars started to reclaim the word in scholarship. And also Chinese Cubans more recently have started to reclaim it. So when I started to do interviews with people, I noticed that they were saying, oh, you know, I just learned my grandfather was a coolie. And so that's one of the reasons I used it. I used it for the first time in quotation marks and then dropped the quotation marks, which was more of a stylistic, you know, a press suggestion. But I think, you know, especially as I think through these issues, I think it's on a deeper level, just kind of a reclaiming of the whole, of making sure that history is not erased.
If we go back to the 19th century, I mean, both of your books abound in just the power of details and the power of evocation. With you, Gaiutra, just the number of people who died on ships. At one stage, it was vastly in excess even of African slaves. And some of that you evoked in your description of, as it were, a kind of Indo-Caribbean Middle Passage, a phrase to use very lightly, but the numbers are such, and the kind of inattention and the kind of the willful violence done to many of the people on board suggests that it's not just a casual analogy. And Kathleen, in your work, you talk about how at one point the rate of Chinese suicide in Cuba was the highest of any group in the world anywhere. And can you talk about just what surprised you in your researches? Because on the one hand, we have these epic flows, we have these grand stories, we have these words of transnationalism, and then you have the killing detail, the kind of narrative puncture that punctuates both your works.
Well, the most surprising element for me, this book really began as a personal journey. I was interested in finding out about my great-grandmother and why she had left India. She was pregnant and she was traveling without a husband. And at first I thought, my goodness, what an exceptional story. But as I started to do more of the research, I discovered that it wasn't exceptional. It was actually, she was representative of most women who left. 75% of them were traveling by themselves, not in family groups. So I think that fundamentally is what was most surprising to me, that this was not a migration of families, but of people whose family ties had already been broken, their bonds had already been broken.
And I think for me, beginning with reading the Cuban scholarship, the very first works that had been done do present the Chinese indentured laborers as somewhere a transition toward free labor. And to actually read the testimony of Chinese themselves, but even the testimony of planters who you wouldn't think would be writing about this kind of stuff. One of the things I looked at were plantation letters. And so to read the testimony of planters that Chinese are throwing themselves into the sugar vat, literally, they're becoming part of the very sugar that they're making. So they, on the one hand, it's this awfulness and the tragedy. But on the other hand, it also is a kind of resistance, because as they are committing suicide, they're also stopping up production for a very long period of time. And this happened routinely. It sometimes happened in groups. So I think as far as what surprised me, I was surprised at every turn of the way. Yeah.
And then even in those cases of resistance via suicide, sometimes it gets characterized as just another example of a kind of truculence of the Chinese laborers. Mm-hmm. One of the things that also surprised me, because I don't know why, I assumed that they were lost to their homelands when they moved. But you talk very intriguingly about the increasing nationalist concern in the latter part of the 19th century about the need to protect the rights of indentured laborers in China. And you talk about how much of the sort of some of the most important campaigning to get rid of indenture happened with Gandhi and with various other politicians in India itself.
Right. The campaign against indenture, the campaign to abolish indenture, was the first victory by the nationalists in India. And what was really interesting to me about that was how central women were to that battle rhetorically. The early nationalists focused on stories of women being exploited, raped on the plantations. So the honor of the Indian woman was being violated overseas. How can we let this happen? And it was a central part of their campaigning in pamphlets and in newspaper articles. So it was interesting to me to see that this rhetorical battle was being fought over the bodies of women, while on the plantations there was a literal battle being fought over the bodies and the honor of women. Uprisings were, of course, tied to economic conditions, illegally low wages, but there were also uprisings sparked when overseers were in relationships, some consensual, some non-consensual, with women, Indian women on the plantations.
Can you talk a bit about the part of the origin of this project? Because you start off, as you showed, with a photograph of your own family. Well, no, you didn't show that photograph, but you show your own family, and you talk about your family coming to New Jersey in a period in the 1980s where it was common to have sort of roving gangs kind of tattooing or graffitiing people's houses with dot busters or Hindus go home and that. And part of your interest in revisiting imaginatively and historically Indo-Guyana is partly a kind of working through of your very vexed relationship with America itself.
Right. I start the book in 1981 when my family left Guyana. I was 6. And I realized I had to start at that point, to the point of emigration and arrival in the United States, because we arrived in New Jersey at a time when there was a racist gang active, the Dot Busters, and they were active in our very neighborhood. An Indian doctor was attacked severely with baseball bats. Another man was killed, and we experienced like low-level attacks as well. Someone wrote "Hindus go home" on our garage door. Someone chased my dad down the road with broken bottles. So, having left a place that was struggling with racial issues, we arrived at a place where we were outsiders and racially marked. And marked as Indians, interestingly enough, although we didn't see ourselves in that light. We saw ourselves as Guyanese. That's how we identified. But we were victimized because the attackers saw us as Indian. And so, that was kind of central to my questions, really, about who I was. Those questions started there at the age of 12 in Jersey City. And ultimately, that's what sort of drove me to pursue this story. That's not where I ended. I became more interested in issues of gender and how my identity was formed in those historic struggles over gender. But it began as a question of, who am I, where do I fit?
Yeah. Kathy, your book, I think you touched upon this, has Cuba at its center, but what emerges cumulatively is a sort of series of connected geographies. I was very surprised to learn about how sort of precise some of the connections and links were between Chinese Cubans and Chinese runaways, effectively, in places like Louisiana. And by the 20th century, the sort of connected network of ports and other cities, San Francisco, New York, countries like Jamaica, they're not kind of impaled by microgeographies. They are crafting and fashioning their own globe, even if they seem from the outside to be very constricted.
Yeah, that was probably one of my biggest challenges in writing the book. It was on the one hand how to incorporate the research I had done in China, on the villages where migrants had left from, and incorporate that with the 19th and 20th century Cuban history. But when I came across the material, and it wasn't that I came across it, I mean, I actively sought it out, demonstrating that many of the Chinese who came in the 20th century indeed were trying to get to the United States. And they did so maybe by hopping over to Jamaica for a few months to a few years and then jumping on a ship. There were all kinds of ways. So my challenge was, this is what Jack and I were talking about this earlier, this is actually another book. But it had to also go into this book because it's some of the very same people. On the other hand, what I do also argue is that many Chinese already had, anyone who studies migration know that it's network-based. So many of the Chinese who came already had networks in Cuba, so that's where they intended to settle. And that's where they stayed even through the 1940s when U.S. restrictions were dropped or liberalized, and they could have come over. So the two things that I really wanted to focus on was this transnational world of Chinese migrants, and also the people who were not the merchants, the big transnational merchants that we learn about in documents, but people like Pastor Pelayo, who did maintain strong ties back to China and did it through his single association on his street in Cienfuegos.
I'm going to hand over to the audience in a second, but I have one question about endings. They're very different, the endings in terms of narrative, in terms of tone, in terms of ambience. Yours is fascinating because it speaks to a kind of a re-emergence or the greater visibility geopolitically, strategically, of China in contemporary Cuba. The legacies of socialist friendship are re-emphasized. China is the second largest trading partner of Cuba after Venezuela. You talk about various modes of almost self-orientalization of people and its uses, as is the case often with Chinatowns across the world, to the tourist industry. It seems quite upbeat ending, as if the traces, the residues of Cooliedom are going to get only louder and more visible as the years go by.
So the traces are going to get
more loudly, or a version of Chinese Cuban history is going to increasingly be peddled.
Yes, and it's going down that road. And I think especially as new Chinese now are coming to Cuba temporarily, the situation on the ground is changing every day. So my last trip there was in 2012, and I can barely keep up with what's happened the past year. Thousands of Chinese students are studying at University of Havana, learning Spanish. In exchange, hundreds of Cubans are going on scholarship to China. There's increasing diplomatic, economic ties. The investment hasn't been as big because Cuba is still very hard to actually invest in businesses. But one thing I would caution, and I'm hoping, and I'm seeing that some of the Cuban scholars who work on this, is to not forget the history. So, for example, along with the Chinese who are settling, ultimately will start to set up associations. One of the things that's happened is because this community really went into decline, at a certain point there were only 500 or so, all of the ethnic associations have opened up to mixed descendants. So Mitzi Espinosa Luis, who you saw the video of, is actually the cultural liaison of one of these main Chinese cultural associations, ethnic associations. In any other society, she would not be even admitted. And this only happens beginning in the 1980s, that they opened it up to mixed descendants and grandchildren. Even if you're 1/8 Chinese, you can join these associations. So she's reported back to me that there's actually been a little bit of a retrenchment on that. They're not continuing that policy because they see the beginnings of new migrants. and just the inequalities that are resulting from that.
Gayatri, your ending is very dark. We were very familiar with those kind of sort of genealogical narratives of, going back to your roots and, crying a little bit, being a little bit doleful, looking at some photographs, cuddle, cuddle, hug, hug, a cheesy message for the sort of notional liberal humanist viewer. Yours goes to an entirely darker zone.
Right. I didn't know that it would end there. I went back to Guyana initially to do archival research, and as I was preparing for this trip, I was reading the newspapers, the Stebert News, and came across reports on crimes that looked astonishingly like the crimes I was reading about in 1903 newspapers, women being killed, being attacked using the cutlass, which is the tool from the cane fields repurposed as a weapon. So we're talking about really horrific, unspeakably horrific dismemberments, essentially, and ongoing. And there was no way that I could look away and not write about that and not explore its roots and ask questions about whether it's rooted in the history of indenture and how so. So the book actually ends with a woman who was attacked by her husband in 2010 and survived. He committed suicide after he attacked her. He thought she was dead. But I actually, I don't see it as a dark ending because I see her as a survivor, and that's why I chose her as the person to end the book with, because I see her as, kind of personifying the survivor's spirit that so many of the indentures who made that voyage had and had to have.
Absolutely, that, yes, with the bravery and the persistence and the desire to speak, absolutely comes through. We have time for responses, questions.
Hi, thank you. Okay, thank you so much for that. I'm Nadim Bawalsa. I'm at the Middle East and Islamic Studies Department, and my research fits so perfectly into this a larger framework of transnational movement, 19th, 20th century. And I look at Palestinians specifically in the context of greater Levantine movements of Lebanese and Syrians and Turks and Greeks and Armenians and so forth. And so I wanted to ask specifically about this issue of return that, Kathy, you mentioned towards the end of your talk, and to what extent that figures into the historical narrative rather than today. Today, certainly there's movement back and forth, but at a time when, let's say, the to and fro movements were a little less reliable and were a little out of the realm of the possible for economic reasons, for physical reasons, for medical reasons. To what extent did return figure in the imagination of these immigrants, not just in terms of remittances, but also in terms of nostalgia and the actual ability to go if they could? And I ask this specifically because for Palestinians, as opposed to the Lebanese and Syrians, they could not return because of British legislation that comes along with the mandate to allow European Jews at the expense of about 30,000 Palestinian immigrants across Latin America at the time. So that becomes the focus for them, both nationalistically and personally, whether they can return and how. And Gayatri, a question for you just about your great-grandmother. I wonder, she seems to have left wanting to go, even though she was indentured. I wasn't sure about that. You mentioned that she had some family issues, that she had already had sort of disconnected from the larger family and wanted to leave. And then I wondered if she ever thought about going back and if she could. And, yeah.
Yes. So if I could address both questions, actually, the right of return was written into the indenture contracts, and about a quarter of indentured Indians actually returned to India. And it was not a triumphant return for many of them because some of this had to do with caste. Voyaging by sea, according to Hindu orthodoxy, was one of the reasons for losing caste. So going back, they often were not accepted into their villages and by their families and ended up in squatter settlements in Calcutta along the river. It's a really tragic story. I'm told that my great-grandmother, she talked about returning, cried about it, said that she wanted to, But by that time, she had a new family in Guyana, two new families in Guyana, actually, and children. And I don't think it would have been possible for her to do so. She would have had the right to go back if she wanted. And the government actually changed the terms of that right of return over the decades. You know, it sort of depended on whether planters wanted a settled community or not. So initially, it was a fully paid voyage back to India, and then it was, 1/3 of it, a bit less.
So in the case of Chinese indentured laborers in Cuba, they similarly, the contracts did promise them return passage, and that certainly was the, emigrants' expectation that most of them were men. It was overwhelming, something like 99% in the Cuban case. But it was the expectation that he would return. It only happened for about 2000, and it was men that were able to get off the plantations and find their own way back, usually kind of heading to New York first or one of the other Caribbean port cities. So most either died or stayed and survived the plantation experience. In the 20th century, it was what you see happening in the Chinese diaspora all over throughout the Americas, where, again, the expectation was return, but it was much more possible to. And so people were able to make return trips. It wasn't once a year, but it might have been, in the case of this small merchant, Louis Fan, who's peddling vegetables, 3 times, and 3 times very close together so he could have children. The situation changed for a lot of Chinese in Cuba when they did establish Cuban families. But you still have stories of people who went back. So the gravestones say a lot about religion and identity and culture. And now, as a result of the revitalization, what I've noticed is some of those are being dug up for the first time in 50 years, and the bones are being sent back.
You also talk, Gaiutra, about a number of hustlers and conmen who promise Indians that they'll show them a way to go home.
Right, and also there was a way to be restored to caste, but it was very expensive. If you paid a priest or a pandit a certain amount of money, technically you were back to being a Brahmin or whatever it is that you were, and that was a form of con as well.
Thank you. I'd like to thank both of you. My name is Roberta Kilkenny. I teach at Hunter College. I taught for 10 years at the University of Guyana, and my work was on the Leonora sugar workers' strike of 1939, in which Indo-Caribbean, Indo-Guyanese women were very much involved, but underrepresented in the histories that had been done. One of my questions is for both of you. The second, I'm not sure if it's for both of you, but both of you can address it. The first has to do with the challenges of doing research. That scene in the BBC documentary of David Dabadine is not in a cowshed, it's in the National Archives of Guyana, where the records are crumbling. So one of my questions has to do with just the physical challenge of doing the kind of archival research that you engaged in. And the other has to do with the reception of your work within the community, whether it's the Guyanese community, Guyanese American community, the Cuban community, Cuban Chinese, whatever variation of that. I'm particularly aware of the challenges in doing Guyanese history because of the political conflicts between persons of Indian and African descent, and how that impacts on people's notions of what history is supposed to be as opposed to what it might actually be. But also the gender issues, because you mentioned something that Rhoda Reddick, who's Trinidadian, had raised many years ago about the relative autonomy of Indian indentured women in the Caribbean, and she came under serious attack from male Indo-Caribbean historians in Trinidad, while some of their wives were saying, forget about what my husband is saying. I can tell you stories from my village where a woman had 2 husbands at the same time and that kind of thing, suggesting that there really was this autonomy that men were not prepared to accept. So, those two questions, the challenges to doing the research and then the community's response to your work.
Well, the book is out on Friday, officially in the United States, but people in the community know that I've been working on it and have given me feedback already, some of it positive, some of it not so positive. I mean, I feel a real sense of the burden of representation, the burdens of representation, and I want to get it right. I want to be sensitive to everyone's concerns over things like the use of the word coolie. A young woman wrote to me basically saying, here you are, someone with the access to institutions, et cetera, to write our history, and you've decided to focus on our women, as she used the word sluts. And that was very painful for me. I mean, the book is not about that. It's about sort of the tension between freedom and enslavement, really. And Rhoda Reddick's work was very important to me in conceiving and formulating this book. I think, after all of the research, the conclusion I came to was that there was sort of this fragile opening for autonomy, but at the end of the day, these were women whose lives unfolded in plantation settings, and their lives unfolded in the total control of the plantation. So they exercised what little freedom they could, using their scarcity almost as leverage. But at the end of the day, I mean, how much choice did they really have? So I think that my conclusions are a little more pessimistic than Rhoda Reddick's. In terms of the research, much of it was actually done in London, looking at colonial office correspondence. But I did spend some time at the National Archives in Guyana looking at ship manifests, and almost wanted to cry when they presented them to me without any gloves or anything. They said, just go for it. And of course, they start crumbling in my hands. And I mean, there really isn't a set procedure for who has access to what and for how long. I sort of sweet-talked one of the workers at the archives into letting me have the book of the Clyde, which is the ship my great-grandmother sailed on. And it was all very furtive. She said, I'm not supposed to give this to you, but I'll look the other way. And I went through that book and looked at the immigration passes of every single woman aboard and was able to get this incredible level of detail about their backgrounds. And there would be marginalia written, like in my great-grandmother's case, pregnant 4 months. In another case, hermaphrodite. This incredible level of detail about individual lives.
So the challenges were many in doing this kind of history. I mean, the obvious are the language, transnational, doing work in 2 different countries, one of which the U.S., Cuba, the U.S. does not maintain trade relations with. There's an embargo, so you have to go through all kinds of hoops to be able to travel there legally. China was relatively easier. A lot of documentation, but it was easier to get around. One of the things, though, is I was really doing kind of, in one sense, a subaltern research, so people who don't end up in main catalogs or archives. So looking to get these family histories, looking in people's shoe boxes where things are decaying, and there's no photocopy machine. In 1999 Cuba, even if there was one in town, you couldn't get to it from the village that I would be doing the work in. So just things like that, and not having, now we have all of these portable things that we can carry around with us, and even the archive will let you take them in. But one of the things I want to highlight for graduate students and undergraduates who are thinking about engaging in research is not everything is digitized today. Not everything. I don't even know what percent. 5%, and that's of the kind of official correspondence. So really, since I was looking particularly post-indenture, then you start to lose the record. There's not, I followed their movement, so I no longer was in Havana, where the main Barrio Chino, the Chinatown, was set up. I had to look at these sugar towns in the central part of Cuba. Nothing is, not only is it not digitized, but it's not basically archived. So to go through the notarial records, you basically have to take a big volume and go page by page by page, and there's a whole room full of these, and see what looks like a Chinese name or see if there's an ethnic marker. And that's how I found, some of these stories that appear in the book. In China, same thing. I was kind of going to the local libraries rather than the big #1 archive that everyone works on for Qing, or the Nanjing archive for the Republican period. I was in the Taishan County Library, Taishan County Archive, finding books that aren't on WorldCat, that have been published by Chinese scholars, but somehow are not on WorldCat. Trying to get a photocopy of that, finding all kinds of Chinese publications that were published in the early 20th century and having to hand transcribe them. So I think, there's a collective effort now. People are, and this is what we call crowdsourcing, people are doing their own thing and scanning family photographs, which is great. But just remember that if it's not digitized, doesn't mean it doesn't exist.
And I forgot to say something very basic, which is the main frustration, of course, in doing this kind of research is not having a paper trail to the thoughts of your subjects, especially subaltern subjects. So you might be able to find glimpses of women in the ship reports, but it's never from their perspective. And I alluded to some of this in my opening remarks, but that's sort of the most fundamental challenge of this kind of work, is the archival silences.
Well, you also went to India yourself and hired translators and had very sort of complicated interactions in villages. We don't have so much time, so with your permission, I'm going to invite a number of questions and responses that you can respond to.
I know this is a historical project, but it's also a very intimate, personal one. I'm curious about the women in your family and their response to the book.
Well, let's take a few.
I'm interested if you could talk about, I guess, the stereotypes that existed about Chinese Cubans and Indo-Ladies, and the stereotypes that exist today. I took a class in college on colonial literature, and we read a book by Indentured, and our professor said the first thing you need to know is that the stereotype that might abound in the United States, that for both Chinese and Indian people, I think of the model minority is not necessarily the case in the Caribbean or in Latin America. And I just kind of intrigued Cuban research, and in my visit there, I've been kind of shocked at the kind of casual racism that abounds about Chinese immigrants there now. So maybe not historically, but I'm just interested in that.
I have a Cuban American friend, and he's a filmmaker, and going back to Cuba for anyway, it's a long story. But while she has relatives in Cuba, and she came back to New York with a film by a filmmaker, a Cuban Chinese film about the 5 Chinese authors before the revolution. It's pretty interesting how they were trying to keep the culture going in Cuba more than here in America. The Cantonese program, and how further, this little 3-minute clip, but it's called like 5G. This was shown at the film festival about 10 years ago. At that time, they were like 70 years old. By now, I'm sure they're dead. But
They're still alive.
Oh, you met them, you know about them. But the filmmaker himself wanted it to be distributed around in America. So we could continue with this other film.
Do you want to respond?
Yes. So, in addition to some criticism from folks in the community, I've also had, just this. People talk to me about how excited they are that I'm telling this story and bringing it to a wider mainstream audience. And it begins with women in my family who were sources and who were very happy to talk to me about my great-grandmother and other women's lives. Although my aunt would say from time to time, but don't put that in the book, okay? But yeah, so there is a sense of these untold stories being told, and and the second question was about stereotypes, the model minority stereotype. Yeah, I think it's very important that there seem to be so many histories coming out at the moment that are recoveries of these subaltern histories of Asians in the Americas. There's Vivek Bald's Bengali Harlem also that sort of push back against this stereotype. All we can do is tell the stories.
I'll respond first. The one on the question about stereotypes is really interesting because from the beginning, Chinese were perceived, they didn't use the word, of course, but they were perceived to be the answer to the labor problem in Cuba. That was, of course, only after the Spanish didn't work out to the extent that they would have liked them to. The Irish and the Germans literally ran away from the plantations. So on the flip side of every kind of model minority image is yellow peril lurking. And you see that through the 20th century, especially in the early 10s, 20s, and 30s, especially around the time of the Depression. There actually are nationalization of labor laws in Cuba that, make it so that you must be 50% of any business had to be comprised of Cuban citizens. And the Chinese and West Indians especially are targets of this. So that's when you see all that typical, stereotypical, imagery. At the same time, one of the points that I sort of argue but really only touch on in the book is that the situation in Cuba is never as bad as it is, for example, in the U.S., in Mexico, where Chinese are actually expelled from northern Mexico in 1930, or places like Jamaica, where there are anti-Chinese riots, and Peru, where hundreds were killed in a given incident. So, and today, I think one of the things with these new kind of infusion of Chinese migrants, you said you've come across the same kind of stereotypes that are just rehashed, but it's what you're finding everywhere about new immigrants changing. What's in it for the average Cuban who has supported the revolution to see Chinese coming in and getting special business privileges or other kinds of privileges is tough, and it's going to produce that kind of stuff. The opera singers are still alive and singing, and they performed in 2012. And what's fascinating about them is that they are of mixed descent, and they were trained. So even before the 1959 revolution, that whole community went into decline because people now were able to come to the U.S. So you didn't have as many performers who were from China itself. So they started to train the children, daughters. They didn't know Chinese, but they memorized the libretto. And so I heard 3 of them perform in 2012, and they still sung beautifully. And I'd love to talk to you after about this filmmaker and.
I think perhaps we should think of both books as songs, as kind of issuing forth mysterious, ghostly, but also beautiful melodies that linger long after you've finished the books. Both of the authors, Kathy and Gaiutra, will be around to talk to you, to answer questions, and also to sign books. We have refreshments available if you want to avail yourself of drinks. Thank you all very much for coming out this evening, and thank you most of all to Gaiutra and to Kathy.